Hey, welcome back. Really glad you're here tonight, or this morning, or whenever it is that you've decided to put everything down and just rest for a while. However you found this video, I hope it means you're somewhere comfortable. Maybe you're already in bed, the lights are low, the day is finally done, or maybe you're winding down slowly, letting the noise of everything quiet around you. Either way, you're in the right place. Tonight we're going somewhere. We're going back, a long way back, to the 16th century. To an ocean that was colder and darker and far more dangerous than most people in that era had ever imagined. We're going to follow the most powerful king in the world as he sends the greatest fleet ever assembled out into the sea, convinced that God himself had ordered it. We're going to be on the water with 30,000 men, watching storms build on the horizon. We're going to find gold on the seafloor 4 centuries later, and we're going to understand what it means when history turns not on the decisions of kings or the courage of soldiers, but on the wind. So, get comfortable, pull the blanket up, close your eyes if you want to, and let's go back to 1588, to the sea, to the storm, and to the fleet that never came home. Off the northeastern coast of Northern Ireland, where the basalt columns of the Giant's Causeway fold themselves down into the sea in formations so perfect they look deliberate. The water is almost always cold. Even in summer, the Atlantic here does not yield warmth. It takes light strangely. At depth, it holds it not at all. The seafloor in these channels is not the sandy, sunlit kind you might picture. It is rocky and silted, carved by currents, covered in the kind of dark that has been unbroken for centuries. In October of 1967, a Belgian diver named Robert Steenhuis descended into exactly this kind of darkness. He had been searching for something for years, following archival threads, cross-referencing, Spanish documents he had read in libraries in Madrid and Seville, charting coastlines on maps that were centuries old. He was looking for a ship. Not just any ship, but a particular one. A galleass, a hybrid vessel of extraordinary size and power that had sailed from Lisbon nearly 400 years earlier as part of the greatest naval armada the Western world had ever assembled. He had reason to believe it was here, somewhere below him, resting on the floor of Port España, the Bay of the Spaniards, a name that the local Irish had never stopped using in the 4 centuries since the wreck had happened. What Steenhuis found that October was not the ship itself. Ships of wood do not survive 400 years intact beneath the sea. What he found was everything the ship had carried. Gold chains so long they coiled on the seafloor like sleeping snakes. Bronze cannons lying at angles where they had tumbled when the hull collapsed. Silver coins minted in the New World, stamped with the face of Philip II of Spain. Navigational instruments, astrolabes and dividers, still precise in their construction even after centuries of submersion. Rings, cameos, a knight's golden salamander pendant set with rubies. The personal belongings of over 1,000 men, preserved not by any miracle but simply by the cold weight of all that water pressing down on them, holding them in place, keeping them exactly where they had come to rest on the night the ship went down. The ship was called the Girona, and it was one of at least 24 vessels, some historians count as many as 30, that sank in the waters around Ireland and Scotland in the autumn of 1588. Those ships, and the men aboard them, were the survivors. They were the ones who had already made it through the English Channel. They had already survived the battle. They had already outrun the English fleet. They were trying to go home. They never made it. The story of the Spanish Armada is one of those historical events that everyone thinks they know. A great fleet, launched by the most powerful king in the world. An English fleet that fought it off against the odds. Drake and his famous game of bowls. The fireships at midnight. England saved. The story is usually told as a story about battles, about heroism, about the plucky island nation defeating the great continental empire. But that version of the story leaves out almost everything. It leaves out the months of planning, the years of political escalation, the personal obsessions of the men involved. It leaves out the storms, those extraordinary, catastrophic storms that did more damage to the Armada than the English fleet ever managed. It leaves out the men who drowned, the men who washed ashore on foreign beaches and were executed. The men who survived somehow and walked across Ireland and Scotland and France to eventually reach home and wrote accounts of what they had seen that were so vivid, so desperate, so full of detail that historians are still quoting them today. And it leaves out the wreck of the Girona. It leaves out Robert Stenui, cold and exhilarated in the dark water off the Giant's Causeway, lifting a gold chain from the seafloor and understanding, for the first time in 400 years, what it felt like to hold something that had belonged to a man who had sailed with the Armada and had not come home. This is the full story. It takes place across 2 years of planning, 2 months of war, 2 weeks of storms, and 4 centuries of silence. It begins in the court of the most powerful man in the world, in a palace outside Madrid, where a king who believed himself chosen by God was making a decision that would send 30,000 men to sea and send most of them into history. To understand what the Armada was, you first have to understand what Spain was in 1580. Not the Spain we might picture now, not just the Iberian Peninsula, not just the country that exists on modern maps. The Spain of Philip II was something that had never existed before in human history, and has arguably never existed since in quite the same form. It was the first truly global empire, a single political entity whose territories included not just Spain and Portugal, but the Netherlands, large parts of Italy, significant portions of what is now Germany and Austria, the Philippines, named for Philip himself, and crucially, the entirety of what was then known as the New World. The Americas, from the southern tip of what is now Argentina to the northernmost reaches of what is now Mexico, all of it was Spanish territory, and all of it was pouring wealth into Madrid in quantities that were almost impossible to comprehend. The silver mines of Potosí, in what is now Bolivia, were producing more silver in a single year than all of Europe had seen in the previous century. The gold of Mexico was being melted down and stamped into coins and loaded into the holds of treasure. Galleons that crossed the Atlantic twice a year in convoys, escorted by warships, carrying fortunes that would make even modern billionaires blink. The Spanish Empire was, by any measurement, the richest and most powerful political entity on the face of the earth, and it was all administered, all directed, all controlled from a single place, a vast grey stone palace monastery called El Escorial, which Philip II had built for himself about 30 miles northwest of Madrid, in the foothills of the Sierra de Guadarrama. Philip himself is one of history's most fascinating and maddening figures. He was a man of extraordinary discipline and almost total contradiction. He worked longer hours than anyone in his court, reading dispatches, writing marginalia in his careful, small handwriting, refusing to delegate decisions that any other monarch would have handed off to a minister. He was described by his contemporaries as austere, pious, cold, and entirely lacking in the theatrical quality that characterized most Renaissance rulers. Where other kings of the period staged elaborate public pageants and held gorgeous courts and surrounded themselves with artists and musicians, Philip worked. He sat at his desk, he read documents, he prayed. He was also, by the standards of his time, a genuinely devout Catholic, and this is crucial for understanding everything that follows. Philip did not think of himself merely as the King of Spain. He thought of himself as the defender of the Catholic faith, the instrument of God's will on earth, the man chosen by divine providence to protect the Church against its enemies. And in the 1580s, the Church had enemies everywhere. The Protestant Reformation, which had begun 60 years earlier with Martin Luther's challenge to Rome, had by now carved a permanent gash across Christian Europe. England had become Protestant under Henry VIII and consolidated that break under his daughter Elizabeth I. The Netherlands, which was Spanish territory, were in open revolt against Spanish rule, and the revolt was explicitly Protestant in character. France was ripping itself apart in wars of religion. From Philip's perspective, the map of Europe was being redrawn by heretics, and it was his sacred duty to stop it. His relationship with England had always been complicated. He had briefly been King of England himself. He had married Mary I, the Catholic queen who preceded Elizabeth in 1554. That marriage had been politically advantageous but personally unhappy, and it had produced no children. When Mary died in 1558, and Elizabeth came to the throne and reversed England's return to Catholicism, Philip had at first tried to manage the situation diplomatically. He had even, in the early years of Elizabeth's reign, proposed marriage to her himself, partly for political reasons, partly because an alliance with England was useful, and partly, perhaps, because he could not quite believe that his red-haired daughter of Henry VIII was going to be as much trouble as she turned out to be. She was, of course, enormously more trouble. Elizabeth I is one of those historical figures who seems almost too perfect for the role she played. Sharp, evasive, theatrical, brilliantly calculated in her use of ambiguity. Where Philip was certain, Elizabeth was flexible. Where Philip declared, Elizabeth suggested. She ran a Protestant kingdom while insisting she had no interest in telling her subjects what to believe in their hearts. She supported the Dutch rebels with money and, eventually, troops, while simultaneously telling Philip she had no intention of making war on him. She licensed English privateers, the polite word for pirates, to attack Spanish treasure ships in the Caribbean and the Atlantic, and then pretended to be appalled when they did so, and occasionally punished them lightly enough that they were back at sea within months. Francis Drake was the most famous of these privateers, a man Philip II would come, with what seems like entirely justified fury, to regard as a personal enemy. Drake had, in 1572, raided a Spanish mule train in Panama carrying silver from Potosi. He had, in 1577 to 1580, become the second person in history to circumnavigate the globe, plundering Spanish ports along the Pacific coast of South America on the way. He had, in Philip's estimation, committed crimes against Spain that would have warranted execution several times over, and Elizabeth had knighted him for it on the deck of his own ship. Through the 1570s and into the 1580s, the relationship between Spain and England deteriorated in a long, slow, grinding way, each year adding new irritants, new provocations, new broken promises. Philip absorbed each one with patience, or something that looked like patience from the outside, though those close to him understood that what was happening was not patience but accumulation. He was tallying, he was waiting, and in 1586 the accumulation finally reached a point that he could not ignore. The event that finally pushed Philip II from reluctant tolerance to active planning was not in the end a naval raid or a diplomatic insult. It was an execution. On the 8th of February, 1587, Mary Queen of Scots, who was the Catholic claimant to the English throne, who was the candidate that English Catholics and foreign Catholic powers had long hoped might succeed or replace Elizabeth, was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle. Elizabeth had signed the death warrant, and then, in the way she handled almost everything she did not want to be seen to have done directly, had been appropriately appalled and had punished her secretary for sending the warrant without waiting for her final confirmation. Nobody believed her. Mary's death removed the last diplomatic cover from the argument about what Philip was planning. If he invaded England and deposed Elizabeth, the ostensible purpose had always been to restore a Catholic monarch to the English throne, and, for years, that monarch had been Mary. She was Catholic, she had a strong dynastic claim, she was already in England. Philip's invasion, in that framing, was not conquest, but restoration. With Mary dead, that argument evaporated. An invasion of England now would clearly be conquest, Spanish conquest, and the English throne would go to whoever Philip chose to put on it, which in practice meant one of his own relatives. The Pope, Sixtus V, had already offered to contribute 1,000,000 gold ducats to the enterprise if it succeeded, a sum that tells you everything about how seriously Rome was taking it. The deal, roughly, was that England would be returned to the Church, and whoever sat on the English throne would hold it as a Catholic monarch under the general approval of Rome and the very specific approval of Madrid. Philip spent the year 1586 and the first months of 1587 planning. He had been, in a low-key way, considering some version of an English enterprise for years, and there were documents in his files going back to the late 1570s that outlined possible strategies. What he was now planning was something categorically different from any of those earlier sketches. He was planning the largest naval operation in the history of the Western world. The plan, in its final form, was this: a great fleet, the enterprise of England, he called it, La Empresa de Inglaterra, would sail from Lisbon north through the Bay of Biscay and up into the English Channel. It would fight its way past the English fleet if necessary, though the hope was to avoid a decisive engagement. It would then rendezvous with an army commanded by the Duke of Parma, Alexander Farnese, the most talented general in Spanish service, who had spent years assembling a veteran force of roughly 17,000 soldiers in the Spanish Netherlands. The fleet would provide naval cover, the army would cross the Channel on barges, and within days of landing the conquest of England would begin. There were problems with this plan, and some of Philip's advisers could see them clearly. The rendezvous between the fleet and Parma's army was the most vulnerable point. It required the fleet to hold a position in the English Channel, which is not a place where ships can easily hold a position, while the army embarked on flat-bottomed barges from the Flemish coast. The Flemish coast was shallow, the Spanish warships were deep-drafted, the English and their Dutch Protestant allies controlled the inshore waters where the barges would have to operate. The coordination required was extraordinarily complex, and there was no reliable way to communicate between Parma and the fleet once the fleet was at sea. These were not small operational difficulties. They were fundamental structural problems with the plan, and the man Philip had chosen to command the fleet, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, Alonso Perez de Guzman, understood them perfectly and said so in writing before the fleet ever left harbour. Medina Sidonia's appointment was itself an indication of the political nature of the enterprise. He was not a naval commander. He was not primarily a military man at all. He was a great nobleman, enormously wealthy, well-connected, politically reliable, and deeply, genuinely reluctant. His letter to Philip upon being appointed commander of the Armada is one of the most extraordinary documents in military history. A man trying, with the utmost respect, to talk the most powerful king in the world out of what the most powerful king in the world had decided. He pointed out that he had no experience at sea, that he was prone to seasickness, that his health was poor, that the previous commander, the Marquis of Santa Cruz, a genuinely experienced admiral who had originally been given the command and who had spent years preparing the fleet, had just died, and that replacing him with someone who freely admitted knowing nothing about naval warfare was perhaps not the best strategy. Philip responded that God would provide and that Medina Sidonia's presence was required. And then, in April of 1587, before the fleet was even half assembled, Francis Drake arrived in Cadiz. He sailed into the harbour with a fleet of 23 ships, spent 3 days destroying everything he could find, burned about 37 Spanish vessels, including several large supply ships that had been loaded for the Armada, and sailed away with what he estimated was 400,000 ducats worth of damage done. He described the raid afterward, in a famous letter, as singeing the King of Spain's beard. Philip read the report of the raid at his desk at El Escorial and, by all accounts, absorbed it in silence. The departure of the Armada was delayed by at least a year. The preparations continued. By the spring of 1588, the fleet that had been assembled in Lisbon was of a size that genuinely had no precedent in the history of European warfare at sea. 130 ships, roughly 30,000 men, counting both sailors and soldiers, something like 2,000 pieces of artillery, ranging from small swivel guns to enormous bronze cannon that took 10 men to operate and fired iron balls that could punch through a ship's hull at close range. 4 months of supplies, provisions that included, according to the detailed inventories that still survive in the Spanish archives, hundreds of thousands of pounds of biscuit, thousands of barrels of salt fish, wine, olive oil, and enough dried beans and lentils to feed an army through a winter campaign. Medical supplies, tools for siege work in case the invasion required it, vestments for priests who were present on every ship and whose job was not merely spiritual but disciplinary, hearing confession, conducting mass, and maintaining the moral framework that Philip believed was essential to a holy war. The Pope's blessing arrived. Masses were said throughout Spain. The Armada was described in the official documents of the time as the Armada Invincible, the Invincible Fleet. The name was not, at the time, ironic. The ships themselves deserved their own attention, because they were not all alike, and the differences between them would matter enormously in what followed. The Armada was not a fleet of identical warships. It was a collection of vessel types drawn from across the Spanish Empire, each suited to different purposes, each with different strengths and catastrophic weaknesses in the conditions they were about to encounter. The largest and most powerful were the galleons. Specifically, 10 of them formed the backbone of the Portuguese squadron, heavy armed warships of 500 to 1,000 tons, carrying 40 to 50 guns each. These were genuine fighting ships, built for naval warfare, and they performed reasonably well in the engagements that followed. The San Martin, Medina Sidonia's flagship, was one of these. It was a ship of roughly 1,000 tons, fast for its size, well armed, and handled by experienced sailors who had served on Atlantic routes for years. But the galleons were a minority. The bulk of the fleet was made up of hulks and urkas, large, round-bellied cargo ships pressed into military service, carrying supplies and troops rather than primarily fighting. These ships were never designed for warfare. They were not nimble. They could not sail effectively into the wind. They were built to carry maximum cargo with minimum crew, which meant that when you filled them with soldiers instead of barrels of saltfish, you had a great many men with very little to do except get sick. The Bay of Biscay in May, even in a normal year, is not a gentle body of water. In the spring of 1588, it was anything but. There were also 4 galleasses, the ship type that the Girona belonged to, which were hybrid vessels that combined oar power with sail. They had been enormously effective in Mediterranean warfare, most notably at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where the Christian alliance had broken Ottoman naval power partly through the use of galleasses. But the Mediterranean and the Atlantic are not the same ocean. Galleasses were designed for relatively calm waters, where their oars gave them manoeuvrability independent of the wind. In the Atlantic swell and the Channel chop, oars were often useless, and the low-sided construction of the galleass made them far more vulnerable to heavy seas than a proper ocean-going galleon. This too would matter. The men aboard these ships were a cross-section of the Spanish Empire at the height of its power, and also of its anxieties. The sailors were largely Portuguese. Portugal had been absorbed into the Spanish crown in 1580, which is why the fleet assembled in Lisbon, and they were experienced Atlantic sailors, men who had made the run to Brazil and back, who knew the trades and the currents and the way the sky looked before a storm. The soldiers were Spanish, mostly veterans of the campaigns in the Netherlands and Italy, professional military men who were supremely competent on land and entirely dependent on the sailors to get them to wherever the fighting would happen. There were also Italians, Germans, Irish exiles who had fled English rule, and a number of enslaved men, galley slaves technically, though by 1588 the Armada was not primarily a galley fleet, whose names do not appear in the historical record and whose fates are accordingly invisible to us. The officers who commanded these ships came from the Spanish nobility, and their quality was mixed in a way that would prove consequential. Some of them were, by any measure, exceptionally capable. Diego Flores de Valdés, who served as Medina Sidonia's naval advisor, had decades of Atlantic experience. Miguel de Oquendo, who commanded the squadron of Guipúzcoa, was a fighter by temperament and training who would hold his ships together through conditions that broke others. But others were political appointments, noblemen who commanded by virtue of birth rather than ability, and who would, under pressure, make decisions that are still being debated by historians. The provisions that had been loaded onto the fleet were, by the time the fleet actually sailed, already partially spoiled. The barrels that had been prepared for the Armada had been made in many cases from green wood rather than seasoned wood, a consequence of Drake's raid on Cadiz in 1587, which had destroyed a large quantity of seasoned barrel staves that were waiting to be used. Green wood barrels do not seal properly, the water they contained became contaminated, the food stored in them began to rot. When the Armada finally cleared Lisbon in late May of 1588, thousands of men were sailing on provisions that were already compromised, into waters that were going to be hard against an enemy that was waiting for them, on a mission that their own commander had told the king was misconceived. The prayers said at departure were genuine. They needed to be. The Armada left Lisbon on the 18th of May, 1588, to the sound of cannon salutes and the singing of the Litany of the Saints. The departure had been preceded by a mass of extraordinary solemnity in the cathedral, attended by the entire officer corps, and Medina Sidonia had received a blessed banner from the Archbishop of Lisbon that was meant to signify the religious character of the enterprise. Every ship in the fleet had priests aboard. Every morning began with prayers. The soldiers and sailors had been instructed to conduct themselves with the discipline appropriate to men engaged in a holy war, which in practice meant prohibition on gambling, swearing, and the presence of women, though historical accounts suggest enforcement of these rules was uneven. Almost immediately the weather intervened. The fleet had barely cleared the mouth of the Tagus when it ran into the heavy swells and contrary winds that characterized the Bay of Biscay in late spring. The round-bellied hulks wallowed and took on water. Men were sick in their hundreds. The galleasses, with their low freeboard, shipped seas badly. Within days, ships were separated from the main body by weather. Supply lines became confused. Medina Sidonia, who had promised Philip that he would report every development by dispatch boat, was already writing letters that had a tone of controlled alarm. Everything was proceeding, but the fleet was not together, and the fleet needed to be together. By mid-June, the weather had forced the fleet into the harbour at Corunna, on the northwestern coast of Spain. This was a significant delay. Several ships that had been separated in the storm were still unaccounted for. Others had suffered damage that required repair. The provisions, already compromised by the greenwood barrels, had deteriorated further. More food had to be loaded, more water casks had to be sealed and resealed. Medina Sidonia wrote again to Philip, this time with barely concealed desperation, pointing out that the fleet was in poor condition, that the men were sick, that the provisions were bad, that the weather in the Channel would only get worse as the season progressed, and that if the king would consider suspending the enterprise until the following year, the chance of success would be considerably improved. Philip's response was brief and final. He had prayed on the matter. God had assured him the enterprise would succeed, the fleet was to proceed. So it proceeded. The Armada cleared Corunna on the 22nd of July, 1588, roughly 2 months behind its original schedule, with a good southwest wind filling the sails of 127 ships. Several had been lost or turned back already, and heading north into the Atlantic towards the English Channel. The crossing of Biscay this time was better. The winds were favourable, the sea manageable, and there was a particular kind of morale that comes from finally being underway after months of waiting and preparation, a momentum that carries men past their doubts and their fears and into something that feels, at least for the moment, like purpose. On the 29th of July, the Armada was sighted off the Scilly Isles, at the southwestern tip of England, by an English patrol vessel. The news was in Plymouth, where the English fleet was anchored, within hours. The story that Francis Drake was playing bowls on Plymouth Hoe when the news arrived, and refused to leave his game, saying there was plenty of time to finish the game and beat the Spaniards afterward, may or may not be true. It appears in the historical record several decades after the event, which makes it suspicious, and Drake was not a man who would genuinely have been casual about an incoming enemy fleet. But it has the ring of a story that captures something real about the mood of the English commanders, deliberate performed composure, refusal to be panicked by what was coming. That was itself a kind of strategy. The English fleet, under the command of Lord Howard of Effingham as Lord Admiral, with Drake as Vice Admiral, had been at anchor in Plymouth Harbour. Getting a sailing fleet out of a harbour against a headwind is a laborious business, requiring ships to be warped out by rowing boats. Through the night of the 29th and into the early hours of the 30th, the English fleet worked its way out of Plymouth Sound, emerging into the Channel behind the Armada, which meant the English now held the weather gauge, the crucial tactical advantage of being upwind of the enemy, which gave them the ability to attack when they chose and break off when they chose, without being dependent on the wind. The Armada, meanwhile, was moving up the Channel in its famous crescent formation, a shape designed both to concentrate firepower and to protect the vulnerable transports in the centre. It was an impressive sight. Contemporary accounts describe a fleet that stretched across the horizon, filling the Channel with sail, a moving city of timber and canvas and iron that seemed to those watching from the English cliffs to be too vast to stop. What happened in the English Channel over the following week is one of the most analysed military engagements in history, and also one of the most misunderstood, because it looked, from the outside, like the English were winning, but from the inside it was a great deal more complicated than that. The fundamental tactical problem was this. The Spanish strategy was to reach the Duke of Parma's army and pick it up. Everything else was secondary. The Armada's commanders had been ordered not to seek a major engagement with the English fleet unless it was forced on them, because a major engagement risked damage that would prevent the rendezvous with Parma. The English strategy, correspondingly, was to prevent the Armada from doing anything, to harass it, damage it, slow it down, prevent it from achieving the rendezvous, without engaging at close range, because close range meant boarding, and Spanish soldiers in a boarding action were extraordinarily dangerous. This created a strange kind of battle, or series of battles, in which both sides were simultaneously aggressive and cautious. The English would close to range, fire their guns, and pull away. The Spanish would maintain formation, absorb the fire, and continue up the Channel, occasionally turning to try to close the range and force the boarding action they needed. Neither side achieved what it was trying to achieve. The English inflicted damage on the Spanish ships. They were by general consensus better gunners at long range, and their guns were mounted on wheeled carriages that allowed faster reloading. But they did not inflict the kind of catastrophic damage that would have stopped the fleet. The Spanish maintained their formation and their progress up the Channel, which was a real achievement under sustained fire, but they could not catch the English, and they could not force the boarding action. There were specific engagements during these days that deserve attention, because they reveal the character of the men involved. On the 1st of August, a Spanish galleon called the Nuestra Señora del Rosario, the flagship of the Andalusian squadron, commanded by Pedro de Valdez, a cousin of the fleet's naval advisor, suffered a collision with another Spanish ship during a manoeuvre, damaging her bowsprit and leaving her unable to keep pace with the fleet. Medina Sidonia faced a decision. Stopping to help the disabled ship would slow the whole fleet and expose it to attack. Leaving her meant abandoning a flagship and hundreds of men. He left her. That night, Francis Drake, who had been assigned to lead the English fleet during darkness, his stern lantern the guiding light for the fleet behind him, extinguished his lantern and turned aside to investigate a group of ships he had spotted. Those ships turned out to be German merchantmen, nothing to do with the Armada. But in the meantime, he had found the disabled Rosario, drifting in the night. He offered Pedro de Valdez the choice of surrender or destruction. Valdez surrendered. Drake took the ship, its crew, and its cargo, which included a substantial quantity of silver to pay the soldiers, and rejoined the English fleet in the morning with the air of a man who had done a good night's work. His fellow commanders were furious at the abandonment of the fleet during darkness. Drake's explanation, that he had been chasing some ships he had suspected might be Spanish, satisfied nobody, but nothing was done about it. On the 2nd of August, another Spanish ship, the San Salvador, which had suffered a catastrophic internal explosion, possibly sabotage, though this was never proven, was abandoned and fell into English hands as well. The Armada lost 2 ships without a proper battle, both through their own misfortune, and continued up the channel. By the 6th of August, the fleet had reached the waters off Calais, on the French coast, and anchored there to wait for news from Parma. And here, for the first time, the true depth of the plan's structural flaw became visible. Parma was not ready. His army was in the Netherlands, and his barges were in the canals, but the Dutch flyboats, small, fast, shallow-drafted vessels controlled by the Dutch Protestant rebels, who were Spain's enemies in the Netherlands, were blockading the coast. Parma's barges could not come out. The Armada could not go in to help them, because the water was too shallow for the great galleons. They were separated by perhaps 10 miles of water and an unbridgeable tactical gap, and they had no way to communicate about it in real time. Medina Sidonia sent dispatch boats. Parma sent responses. Messages took hours to arrive. The English and Dutch were in the water between them. The fleet lay at anchor off Calais, and the English commanders looked at them and saw their opportunity. The night of the 7th of August, 1588, was dark. The Armada lay at anchor in the roads off Calais, roughly 120 ships in close formation, their lights visible from the shore and from the English fleet anchored upwind of them. The English commanders, Howard, Drake, Hawkins, Frobisher, the whole remarkable roster of Elizabethan sea captains, had been in conference, and they had decided on a tactic that was simple, ancient and terrifying. Fireships. 8 vessels were prepared. They were not the largest ships in the English fleet, but they were substantial. Merchantmen, mostly, requisitioned for the purpose. They were loaded with anything that would burn: spare wood, pitch, tar, gunpowder. Their guns were loaded because a ship on fire in rough water will eventually heal far enough that its guns point at the sea, and then the heat sets them off, and the effect is of a vessel that seems to be fighting even as it burns. Skeleton crews took the ships to the edge of effective range, pointed them downwind toward the anchored Armada, set them on fire, lashed the helms, and rowed away in small boats. The 8 ships moved through the dark, trailing fire, driven by the wind directly toward the Spanish fleet. The Spanish lookouts saw them coming. The alarm spread from ship to ship, and what happened next is the moment that decided the fate of the Armada, not because of the physical damage the fireships caused. In the end, they burned themselves out without hitting any Spanish vessel, but because of what the Spanish commanders did in response. They panicked. Not all of them. Some captains held their nerve and managed controlled movements away from the threat, but many simply cut their anchor cables and ran. Cutting your anchor cable in a tightly packed fleet at night, in a strong wind and a running tide, is a recipe for chaos. Ships collided. The great crescent formation that had been maintained with such discipline all the way up the channel dissolved in hours. By dawn on the 8th of August, the Armada was scattered across miles of the Flemish coast, some ships still near Calais, others driven north by the wind, many without anchors because the cables had been cut. And anchors, it would turn out, were something they would need desperately in the weeks ahead. The Battle of Gravelines, fought on the 8th of August, was the real battle of the Armada campaign, and it was brutal in a way that the channel-running fights had not been. The English fleet, with the wind behind them, pressed close to the scattered Spanish ships and fought at something approaching real range, 100 yards or less in some cases, which was close enough for the full weight of English gunnery to tell. Spanish ships were hulled below the waterline. Men were killed in large numbers. The San Martin, Medina Sidonia's flagship, fought virtually alone for a period, surrounded by English ships taking hit after hit, its hull punctured in multiple places, its casualties severe, until other Spanish captains managed to come to its support. The fighting lasted most of the day. By evening, the Armada had suffered significant damage but had not been destroyed. It had, with what the Spanish afterward acknowledged as extraordinary discipline given the circumstances, managed to cohere back into something like a fleet, and was now moving northward in front of the wind. The English followed, watching, harrying the stragglers, waiting to see what the Spanish would do next. What the Spanish were going to do next was the central question, and it had only one answer. The Duke of Medina Sidonia called a council of war on the San Martin, and his senior officers told him what he already knew. The fleet was damaged. Many ships had expended most of their ammunition in the Channel battles. Without anchors, which had been cut at Calais and could not be recovered, they could not safely anchor anywhere on the Flemish coast to attempt the rendezvous with Parma. The wind was blowing from the southwest, which meant that trying to sail back down the channel would require beating against the wind, which was not something the damaged fleet could manage. The English were behind them. There was only one way to go, north, up past England, around Scotland, and then south again down the Atlantic coast of Ireland and back to Spain. It was a vast detour, roughly 3,000 additional miles, but it was a route where, in theory, the weather would be manageable, where they would not have to fight the English, and where, if they were careful, they could bring the fleet home intact, or at least bring most of it home. Medina Sidonia gave the order. He also issued detailed sailing instructions to all captains, specifying the route, the distance they should keep from the Scottish and Irish coasts, a minimum of 2 leagues, roughly 6 miles, to keep them clear of the rocks, and ordering them to throw overboard the horses and mules that had been brought for the cavalry because the fleet no longer had enough fresh water. To keep them alive, and dead animals aboard ship were both unsanitary and a terrible omen. The horses went over the side. The fleet turned north, and somewhere ahead of them, beyond the horizon, the weather that would finish what the English had started was already beginning to form. The route around Scotland and Ireland that Medina Sidonia had ordered is, on a map, straightforwardly clear. You sail north up the North Sea, keeping England to your left. You pass the Orkney Islands above Scotland. You turn west, then southwest, crossing the open Atlantic. You pass Ireland at a safe distance to the west. You turn south. You eventually reach Spain. In the summer of 1588, with functioning ships and adequate provisions and the right winds, it was a voyage of perhaps 3 or 4 weeks. None of those conditions applied. The ships were not functioning well. The battles in the Channel and at Gravelines had left hulls punctured and partially repaired, rigging damaged and jury-rigged sails, torn and patched with whatever canvas was available. Pumps were running continuously on several vessels to keep them from sinking under the water that came in through shot holes below the waterline. The carpenters and their crews had been working without rest since the battle, and they were working on problems that, in some cases, were not fully solvable. Holes that could be slowed but not stopped. Leaks that were manageable in calm water and would become catastrophic in heavy seas. The provisions were failing. The water that had been contaminated by Greenwood barrels in Lisbon had become worse with time. Men who had been drinking from those barrels since May were sick. Dysentery and typhus moved through the crowded ships. A healthy sailor needs fresh water at roughly a gallon a day under normal sailing conditions. The men on the Armada, doing hard physical work in cold and wet conditions with diminishing rations, were getting a fraction of that. The daily food allowance had already been cut. It would be cut again. By the time the Armada cleared the northern tip of Scotland, passing the Orkneys in mid-August, the fleet was in poor condition but still coherent. Medina Sidonia was in contact with most of his squadron commanders. The weather had been manageable. Men were sick and hungry but alive. The turn west and then southwest into the open Atlantic was made in reasonable order, and for a brief period it seemed possible that the fleet might make it. Then, in the first week of September, the weather changed. What came in from the Atlantic in September and October of 1588 was a sequence of storms of unusual severity, and they came from exactly the wrong direction, the southwest, which was the direction the fleet was trying to sail. Sailing into the wind in a square-rigged ship of the 16th century is an operation of limited effectiveness at the best of times. In storm conditions, with damaged rigging and exhausted crews, it was simply not possible. The fleet was driven east toward the Irish coast, which was exactly where Medina Sidonia's sailing instructions had said they must not go. The problem with the Irish coast, from a sailor's perspective, is not just the rocks, though the rocks are numerous and lethal, but the combination of rocks, Atlantic swell, onshore wind, and the particular character of the Irish seabed in many places, which is either too deep to anchor in or too foul with rocks for an anchor to hold. A ship that finds itself in trouble off the Irish coast in a September gale has very few options. The anchors, the ones that had not been cut at Calais, might hold or might drag. The sails might be managed or might shred. The hull might hold together or might not. Everything depended on the specific condition of the specific ship, the specific stretch of coast, the specific violence of the specific storm, and for the ships of the Armada, those variables resolved over and over in the worst possible way. The ships began to go down. Not all at once. The losses happened over days and weeks, along hundreds of miles of coastline, from Donegal in the north to Kerry in the south. Some went on rocks at identifiable points. Some were simply overwhelmed by the sea and sank in deep water, leaving debris and bodies but no locatable wreck. Some anchored, held for a day or two while the storm raged, and then drove ashore when the anchors finally dragged or the cables finally parted. The names of the ships that were lost in this way form a kind of litany: the Santa Ana, the El Gran Grifon, the Rata Encoronada, the San Juan de Sicilia, the Duquesa Santa Ana, the Juliana, the Lavia, the Santa Maria de la Visión, and then, later, the Girona. The Santa Ana went ashore on the Blasquet Islands off the Kerry coast, the Rata Encoronada carrying Alonso de Leyva, one of the most senior and respected noblemen in the fleet, who had been Philip's original choice for the command before the political compromise that produced Medina Sidonia, grounded in Blacksod Bay in County Mayo. De Leyva managed to get most of his men ashore and then secured passage on the Duquesa Santa Ana, which was lying nearby. The Duquesa Santa Ana then drove ashore in a second storm in Lochross Small Bay in Donegal. De Leyva was injured in the landing. His leg was badly hurt, probably broken, and he could no longer walk unaided. He and his surviving men, several hundred of them now, a small army of castaways on the Irish coast, made their way overland to a bay called Port na Spaniog, where another Armada ship, the Girona, was being repaired after sustaining her own storm damage. The situation that faced the survivors of the Armada who made it to the Irish shore was one of the most desperate that can be imagined, and it was made worse, systematically worse, by the actions of the English administration that governed Ireland at the time. Ireland in 1588 was not simply a country. It was an occupied country in the early stages of a process of conquest and colonisation that the English crown had been conducting, with varying intensity and success for several centuries. The administration was headed by Sir William Fitzwilliam, the Lord Deputy, whose instructions from London regarding the Armada survivors were utterly unambiguous. Elizabeth's government was terrified that the Armada survivors, if they were numerous enough, if they were armed, if they found support among the Irish population, could form the nucleus of a pro-Spanish, anti-English force in Ireland that would be enormously difficult to dislodge. The order went out: no quarter. Survivors were to be killed wherever they were found. Those who sheltered them were to be punished. The execution of this order was carried out with varying degrees of thoroughness and enthusiasm. English soldiers and their Irish allies killed Armada survivors in large numbers in several locations. The most well-documented massacre took place at Stridor Strand in County Sligo, where 3 ships, the Lavia, the Santa Maria de la Visión, and the Juliana, grounded in a storm on the 21st of September. The ships broke up in the surf. An estimated 1,200 men drowned in the water between the ships and the shore, unable to swim through the breaking waves. Of those who made it ashore, several hundred were killed by English soldiers and by local people who had been warned of the penalties for helping the Spanish. One of the survivors of Stridor Strand was a captain named Francisco de Cuellar, who had been under arrest on the Armada flagship. He had been court-martialed for breaking formation during the Channel battles, an irony that saved his life, since the arrest meant he was still aboard when the ship ran aground rather than having been transferred to one of the ships that sank. His account of what happened at Stridor, and of the months that followed, is one of the most vivid personal documents to survive from the entire Armada story. He wrote it as a letter addressed to a friend in Spain after he had eventually made it home, and it reads like a dispatch from a world of almost unimaginable hardship. He describes the breaking up of the ships. He describes the bodies in the water and on the beach. More than 400 of them visible from where he stood, he wrote. The sea full of them. The shore covered with debris and the dead and the dying. He describes hiding in a marsh while soldiers moved through the beach killing survivors. He describes the extraordinary landscape of Western Ireland, the bogs, the mountains, the cold rain that came in from the sea, almost without pause, and his attempts to navigate it without speaking the language, without knowing the country, without food or shelter. He found protection, eventually, in the castle of a local chieftain named Brian O'Rourke, who was openly hostile to the English and willing to shelter the Spanish at significant personal risk. He spent weeks among the Irish, moving from place to place, hiding when English patrols came close, eating what he could find. He eventually found passage on a Scottish vessel and made it back to the continent, to Flanders and then home to Spain. His account is not just an adventure story, remarkable as it is. It is a portrait of Ireland as seen by an outsider at a particular moment in its history, a country in the early stages of colonial trauma, where some people would risk their lives to help strangers, and others would turn those same strangers in for a reward, where the landscape itself seemed to conspire against survival, and where the presence of the Spanish, thousands of them dying on the beaches, created a complicated human situation that the simple categories of ally and enemy could not fully contain. Other survivors had other experiences. Some were sheltered and helped, particularly in areas of Connaught and Ulster where English authority was weakest and Irish resistance to that authority was strongest. Some of these men chose to stay. They had made it to the edge of the world, and returning to sea seemed more dangerous than remaining on land. A small number of Spanish survivors are believed to have been absorbed into Irish society, married Irish women, and disappeared from the historical record in a way that makes them, to subsequent generations, a kind of shadow population. The Spanish Irish, the descendants of the Armada, a genetic and cultural trace that some Irish families still claim. And then there was Alonso de Leyva, with his several hundred survivors, and the Girona. De Leyva had gotten his men to the Girona at Port España, the same bay where Robert Stenui would later dive and find the wreck. The Girona had been repaired as well as could be managed, and de Leyva made the decision to sail. He was loading the ship beyond its designed capacity, a galleass built for a crew of perhaps 300 was now carrying upwards of 1,300 men, the survivors of 3 separate ships. But the alternative was remaining on the Irish coast through autumn and winter, at the mercy of English soldiers and the deteriorating weather, and that seemed worse. The Girona left Port España on the 26th of October, heading north around the Irish coast, intending to reach Scotland where there were contacts who might provide further transport to the continent. On the night of the 26th, she ran onto a rock called Lacada Point at the base of the Giant's Causeway. The exact sequence of events cannot be recovered. There were very few survivors, and their accounts are fragmentary, but the result was that a ship carrying 1,300 men struck a rock in the dark and went down so fast that almost nobody got off. 9 survivors reached the shore. 1,300 did not. Alonso de Leyva, who had survived 2 previous shipwrecks in the Irish, Storms, who was injured and could not walk without help, who was perhaps the most celebrated young nobleman in the entire Armada, was among those who drowned. Philip II, when the news eventually reached him, is said to have been more affected by de Leyva's death than by any other single piece of news from the entire catastrophe. The news of the Armada's fate did not arrive in Madrid all at once. It came in pieces, over months. A dispatch from Medina Sidonia's ship, which had made it back to the Spanish coast in late September, battered but afloat. Reports from Parma in the Netherlands about the failure of the rendezvous. Accounts from the survivors who trickled into Spanish and Portuguese ports through the autumn. Letters from Spain's ambassadors in France and Scotland collecting information about ships that had wrecked or about survivors who had reached those countries. The full picture took most of the winter to assemble. When it was complete, it showed that somewhere between 60 and 65 ships had been lost, roughly half the fleet that had left Lisbon in May. Of the 30,000 men who had sailed, somewhere between 15 and 20,000 were dead. The scale of the disaster was without precedent in Spanish military history. Philip II received the news in the way he received almost everything. At his desk, in El Escorial, reading dispatches. Those who observed him in the weeks after the full extent of the catastrophe became clear described him as unchanged in his daily routine. He continued to work, to attend Mass, to read and annotate documents, to conduct the ordinary administration of his empire. He did not weep publicly, he didn't rage. He reportedly said, in various formulations that differ slightly between sources but agree in substance, that he had sent his fleet against men and not against God's storms, that the failure was in the execution of a divinely ordained mission, not in the mission itself, and that God's will would eventually be done. Whether this represented genuine theological conviction, psychological armour, or the performance of equanimity that a king was expected to maintain in front of his court, is something that historians have debated for 4 centuries without resolution. Philip was a man who kept his interior life extraordinarily private. His correspondence, voluminous as it is, rarely reveals what he actually felt as distinct from what he thought, and even his thoughts are often expressed in terms of policy and theology rather than emotion. What is documented is the practical response. Philip immediately ordered the construction of new ships and the rebuilding of Spanish naval power. He did not abandon the idea of another English enterprise. He launched 2 more armadas against England, in 1596 and 1597, both of which were also disrupted by storms, a fact that the English interpreted as continuing divine favour, but which Philip, to his credit, interpreted as bad weather, requiring better planning. He died in 1598, having never successfully reconquered England, but having never entirely given up the attempt. The disaster of 1588 did not destroy the Spanish Empire. Spain would remain the dominant power in Europe for another generation at least. The silver from America kept flowing, the armies in the Netherlands kept fighting, the Catholic faith kept its hold on southern Europe. But something had changed that could not be entirely accounted for in material terms. The myth of Spanish invincibility, the idea that had been carefully cultivated over decades of military success, that God had specifically chosen Spain as his instrument, had been damaged in a way that the construction of new ships could not repair. The question of what the Armada's failure actually meant, what it changed, what it decided, what the world looked like afterward that it would not have looked like if the outcome had been different, is one of the most genuinely interesting questions in historical speculation, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Start with the most obvious counterfactual. If the Armada had succeeded, if Parma's army had crossed the Channel and landed in England, what would have happened? The answer, like most answers in this territory, is complicated. England in 1588 was not defenceless. There was an army, of sorts, assembled at Tilbury under the Earl of Leicester, and Elizabeth's famous speech to those troops, delivered, if the traditional date is right, while the Armada was still in the Channel, is one of the great pieces of royal rhetoric in English history, with its declaration that she might have the body of a weak and feeble woman but the heart and stomach of a king. The Tilbury army was in reality poorly equipped and barely trained, but it existed, and the English countryside was not a place where an invading army could move easily. But Parma's force was the best professional army in Europe. The Spanish tercio formations had been dominant on European battlefields for half a century. If they had gotten across the Channel, and a crossing was not inevitable even if the Armada had made the rendezvous, because the Dutch flyboats were a real obstacle, they would have been fighting through the English countryside with enormously experienced troops against an army that had not fought a major land engagement in decades. Most military historians who have examined the question believe that Parma would have won. Elizabeth would probably have been captured or killed. The dynastic question of what came next is murky. Philip's candidate was his daughter Isabella, which would have made England in some sense a Spanish client state. But the immediate religious consequence is not murky at all. England would have been returned to the Catholic Church. Protestant worship would have been prohibited. The institutions, the Church of England, the bishops, the parishes, that Henry VIII and Elizabeth had built would have been dismantled, And beyond England, the knock-on effects cascade in ways that are genuinely dizzying. The Dutch Revolt, which depended heavily on English support in money and troops, and which gave the rebels a refuge that the Spanish could never completely close off, would likely have collapsed. Without a Protestant England and a Protestant Dutch Republic, the political and religious geography of Northern Europe in the 17th century would have been entirely different. There would have been no English colonisation of North America in the early 17th century, or at least no Protestant English colonisation. The settlements at Virginia and Massachusetts were founded by people whose religious and political identity was formed in the England that survived the Armada. The Mayflower sailed in 1620 because England was Protestant, because Puritan descent had somewhere to grow, because there was a whole apparatus of Protestant culture and commerce that made Atlantic colonisation a viable project for English entrepreneurs and religious communities. This is the largest claim that can be made about the Armada's failure, that the storms of September and October 1588 preserved not just England, but, in a very real sense, the conditions that made the modern Anglophone world possible. The United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the whole sprawling inheritance of British colonialism, with all its catastrophic costs for the peoples who were colonised and all its undeniable shaping of the modern world, is downstream of a Protestant England surviving in 1588, which is itself downstream of Atlantic storms that drove a Spanish fleet onto Irish rocks. Elizabeth I understood the propaganda value of what had happened, even if she could not have understood the full historical weight of it. The commemorative medal that was struck after the Armada's defeat carries a Latin inscription that translates as "He blew, and they were scattered," a reference to God directing the winds against Spain, framing the outcome as divine judgment against Catholic aggression and divine protection of Protestant England. The Armada portrait of Elizabeth, painted shortly after the events of 1588, shows the Queen with her hand resting on a globe, serene and authoritative, while through the windows behind her, two scenes play out. In one, the English fleet in calm water, in the other, the Armada breaking up in a storm. The message is not subtle. The English had fought. They had fought effectively and skillfully. But the painting is honest about something that the official narrative tended to downplay. The storms did more than the fleet. The storms were, from a purely military standpoint, the decisive factor. England's survival was a joint production of human skill and meteorological accident, and the medal's inscription gives the meteorological accident to God, which is one way of handling the fact that he was substantially saved by the weather. In Spain, the mythology ran in the opposite direction. The Armada's failure was not a defeat. It was a divine test, a chastisement, a temporary setback in an enterprise that God still willed, but that men had executed imperfectly. This interpretation allowed Spain to absorb the disaster without the kind of fundamental political questioning that a clearly understood military defeat might have provoked. It was, in its way, as useful a piece of mythology as the English version, and it served its purpose for a generation. After the autumn of 1588, the Armada wreck settled into the Irish seabed and the historical records simultaneously. The ships themselves were gradually buried by sand and colonised by marine growth. The artefacts they carried, the guns, the coins, the personal objects, lay where they had fallen or where the sea had scattered them. In some places, objects continued to wash ashore for years and even decades afterward, finding their way into the hands of a local people who had no particular context for them, who kept them, or sold them, or passed them down through families as curious old things with dimly remembered stories attached. The wrecks became part of the landscape of memory in coastal Ireland and Scotland in a way that was different from their presence in formal historical accounts. The formal historical account, the Spanish and English documents, the chronicles, the retrospective histories written in the 17th and 18th centuries told the story from the perspective of courts and commanders and grand strategy. The local memory held something else, the names of bays, the oral traditions about Spanish gold, the stories that fishermen told about particular stretches of coast, where the bottom came up strange on a line, where nets snagged on things that were not rocks, where occasionally after a big storm something old and foreign tumbled out of the sand. Port España, the Bay of the Spaniards, kept its name. The bay where the Girona went down was called the Bay of the Spaniards by the local Irish from 1588 onward, and it was still called that in 1967 when Robert Stenui went looking for it. This is a remarkable act of memory, maintained across nearly 4 centuries without any formal institutional support, no monument, no official designation, just people in a particular place continuing to call a thing by a name that encoded an event, generation after generation, because names are the most durable form of memory that ordinary people possess. There were occasional attempts, in the centuries between the wreck and the 20th century, to locate Armada sites and recover artifacts. Some were successful in a limited way. Isolated objects were found, occasionally identified, sometimes ending up in private collections or local museums with uncertain provenance. But systematic underwater archaeology did not exist before the mid-20th century. The technology required, reliable breathing apparatus, underwater communication, the ability to work on the seafloor for extended periods, underwater cameras, lifting equipment that would not damage fragile objects, was a product of the post-war period. Before that, a ship on the seabed was more or less inaccessible, and what lay on the seabed was, in the absence of the technology to reach it, a matter for speculation and local legend. The Girona slept. The Santa Maria de la Rosa slept, in the Blasket Sound off Kerry where it had gone down on the 21st of September 1588 with almost all hands. The Trinidad Valenciera slept in Kinago Bay in Donegal. The El Gran Griffon slept on Fair Isle, between Orkney and Shetland, where it had grounded on the 27th of September with roughly 300 survivors who were eventually evacuated to Scotland. Dozens of other ships slept in deep Atlantic water west of Ireland, where no anchor had held and no shore had been reached, their contents as inaccessible as the surface of the moon. Robert Stenui was not a professional archaeologist. He was a Belgian writer and adventurer with a deep interest in maritime history and a growing expertise in diving, which in the early 1960s was still a relatively new civilian pursuit. He had read everything he could find about the Spanish Armada. He had read the surviving accounts, the ship manifests, the Spanish naval records. He had read the works of earlier historians who had tried to locate Armada wrecks, and he had, with particular attention, read a collection of documents in the Spanish archives that described the Girona, her specific armament, her route around Ireland, the circumstances of her sinking, the names of the men aboard her. The name Portna Spania, the Bay of the Spaniards, appeared in some of these documents. When Stenui looked at a map of the North Antrim coast, he found the name on the coastline just west of the Giant's Causeway. The proximity of the name to Lacada Point, which the contemporary accounts described as the rock on which the Girona struck, was suggestive. He began planning a dive. The conditions at Portna Spania are not favourable for diving. The water is cold, typically between 7 and 12 degrees Celsius, even in summer. The visibility is variable and often poor, reduced by the particulate matter that the Atlantic swell stirs up from the rocky bottom. The currents are unpredictable. The rocks are jagged. The sea state can change quickly, and the Giant's Causeway sits in a part of the coast that is exposed to the full fetch of the Atlantic, which means that a sea that looks manageable from the surface can become lethal underwater with a change of wind. Stenui made his first dive at Portna Spania in May of 1967. He found nothing immediately, which was not unexpected. A ship that had been on the bottom for nearly 4 centuries would not be visible as a ship. It would be a scatter of objects over an area of seabed, buried to varying depths under sand and sediment, and colonised by marine life to the point where they would blend with the natural bottom. He needed to cover ground systematically, looking for the anomalies, the shapes that were too regular to be natural, the objects that were the wrong colour, the distribution patterns that suggested human origin. He found the first lead ingot, a piece of equipment used for sounding depth, on his second or third dive in shallow water near Lacada Point. It was not immediately identifiable as Armada material, but its presence in that specific location, combined with its age as estimated from its patination, was encouraging. He kept diving. Over the summer of 1967, working with a small team and limited equipment by modern standards, Stenui and his colleague Mark Jasinski uncovered the scatter of the Girona wreck in extraordinary detail. The gold came first in small quantities, individual pieces, a chain link, a coin, and then in greater amounts as they worked outward from the initial finds. The bronze cannons, huge and immovable, were landmarks on the seabed, their weight having pinned them where they had fallen when the hull disintegrated. Between and around the cannons lay everything else: The objects that came up from the Girona are among the most intimate artifacts of the 16th century that exist anywhere in the world, because they were personal objects, the things that men carried with them on a voyage they expected to last months. There was a gold ring set with a ruby, engraved inside with the Spanish words "No tengo más que darte." I have nothing more to give you. We do not know who wore this ring, or who gave it to him, or what circumstances had reduced the giver to having nothing more to offer. There were 5 gold watches, which in 1588 were objects of extraordinary rarity and value. There was a lapis lazuli cameo of Philip II himself. There were gold chains of the kind worn by noblemen as a portable form of wealth, some of them so long they coiled in the diver's hands when lifted from the bottom. There were navigational instruments, brass astrolabes and dividers, that were still, despite 4 centuries on the seabed, precise in their construction. There were silver forks and spoons from what must have been an officer's mess. There were personal seals used for stamping letters with wax. There were rosary beads and crucifixes, because the men of the Armada were Catholic and prayed, because they had priests on every ship, because they believed, genuinely and deeply, that they were in God's hands. There were coins from the New World, silver pieces of 8 from Potosi, gold ducats from the mints of Spain, that had crossed the Atlantic once in a treasure galleon, and were now on the bottom of the Irish Sea, having crossed it again in very different circumstances. And there were the bones, human remains, preserved by the cold and the depth, mixed in the sediment among the coins and the chains and the navigational instruments, the bones of men who had sailed from Lisbon in May of 1588, who had fought in the Channel, who had survived the storms as far as the North Antrim coast, who had perhaps been standing on the deck of the Girona on the night of the 26th of October, when she struck Lacada Point and gone down so fast that almost no one got off. The bones and the gold in the same water, in the same sediment, inseparable from each other as they had been, inseparable from the men who owned them and wore them and carried them and died with them. Stenui brought the artifacts to the surface carefully and systematically, recording their positions on charts that he and Jasinski maintained throughout the excavation. The recovery took multiple seasons of diving. The collection that eventually emerged from Port España numbered in the thousands of individual objects, more, by some measures, than any other Armada wreck has yielded, and more than most shipwrecks of any era discovered in European waters. The Girona collection is now in the Ulster Museum in Belfast, where it has been since the early 1970s. It is displayed in a room designed specifically for it, with the gold chains and the cameos and the astrolabes and the ring with its inscription, "I have nothing more to give you," laid out in cases where visitors can see them. It is one of the most powerful museum experiences in the British Isles, partly because of the quality and quantity of the objects, but mostly because of what they represent: the complete material lives of 1,300 men, compressed by catastrophe and preserved by cold water, brought back into the light after nearly 4 centuries in the dark. Stenui's discovery of the Girona in 1967 opened a period of systematic archaeological attention to the Armada wrecks that has continued to the present day, and which has transformed our understanding of the 1588 disaster in ways that the documentary record alone could never have achieved. In the years after Stenui's publication of his findings, other divers and archaeologists began looking at other Armada sites. The Santa Maria de la Rosa, which had gone down in the Blasket Sound off the Kerry coast, was located in 1968 by a team led by Sidney Wignall, a Welsh diver and historian. The Blasket Sound is one of the most dangerous stretches of water in Ireland, a narrow channel between the Blasket Islands and the mainland swept by fierce currents with visibility that is often measured in inches rather than feet. Working there requires patience, physical toughness, and a tolerance for conditions that most divers would consider prohibitive. The team found the Santa Maria de la Rosa at depth in the Sound, and the artefacts recovered from her, including a lead ingot stamped with the name of the ship's master gunner, which provided definitive identification, are now in the Dingle Peninsula Museum. The Trinidad Valenciera was located in Kinnago Bay in Donegal in 1971 by the City of Derry Sub-Aqua Club, in an act of citizen archaeology that says something important about how the Armada wrecks exist in the consciousness of the communities that live near them. The Trinidad Valenciera had been a large Venetian grain ship, pressed into Armada service, carrying a regiment of soldiers and a battery of siege artillery. The siege guns, enormous bronze pieces intended to reduce English fortresses after the landing that never happened, are still among the largest artefacts recovered from any Armada wreck. The El Gran Griffon, which grounded on Fair Isle between Orkney and Shetland, was excavated in the 1970s and yielded, among other things, details about the construction of 16th century Hanseatic cargo ships that have proved invaluable to maritime historians. The ship was a hulk, one of the type that formed the logistical backbone of the Armada, and its remains provided direct physical evidence for ship construction practices that had previously been known only from documents and paintings. As the decades progressed, the technology available to archaeologists working on Armada sites improved dramatically. Side-scan sonar, which creates acoustic images of the seabed by sending sound pulses to either side of a survey vessel, allowed large areas of the Irish coastal waters to be mapped systematically for the first time. Sub-bottom profilers could detect objects buried under several meters of sand. Remote-operated vehicles with cameras could investigate targets in water too deep or conditions too dangerous for human divers. The combination of these technologies with the archival research that had been accumulating since the 19th century created a picture of the Armada disaster in the Irish coastal waters that is far more detailed than anything previously available. The picture is also, in some ways, more humbling than expected. Decades of searching have located and identified, with varying degrees of certainty, perhaps a dozen Armada wrecks in Irish and Scottish waters. The historical record suggests there should be something approaching 30. The rest are either in very deep water, where even modern technology has not located them, or buried under several meters of sand and sediment in areas where sub-bottom surveys have not been conducted, or have simply been scattered and dispersed by 4 centuries of Atlantic weather to the point where there is no concentrated site to find. The sea is a much more dynamic environment than the average person imagines. Objects on the seabed do not simply lie where they fall and wait to be found. They are moved by currents, they are buried by sediment, then uncovered, then buried again, in cycles driven by storm events, seasonal changes in current, and the longer-term processes of coastal geomorphology. An anchor that was on the surface of the seabed in 1967, when Stenui was diving at Port España, might be buried under 2 meters of sand today, and might be on the surface again in 20 years when a particular storm pattern shifts the sand in a different direction. The search for Armada wrecks is not a problem with a definitive solution. It is an ongoing process, responding to a constantly changing seabed in an ocean that is itself changing. What modern archaeology has also done, beyond finding objects, is to change the questions being asked about the Armada. The documentary record inevitably focuses on the commanders, the strategy, the political context, the decision-making at the top. Archaeology reaches down instead to the ordinary men, the sailors and soldiers whose names do not appear in the strategic dispatches, whose experience of the campaign was not the management of fleets, but the daily reality of a ship at sea in bad weather, sick and hungry and cold, praying to saints whose names were painted on the bulkheads, holding on through storms that were unlike anything the Mediterranean sailors among them had experienced, dying in circumstances so chaotic and so fast that they had no time to leave any record at all. The artifacts speak for these men in ways that documents do not and cannot. There is a particular quality to the autumn light on the North Antrim coast of Ireland. It comes in low and at an angle, the way it does at northern latitudes in September and October, turning the basalt columns of the Giant's Causeway from grey to a deep warm brown for an hour or two in the late afternoon. The sea in that light is dark green where it is shallow, almost black where it deepens, streaked with the white of the breaking swell that comes in from the Atlantic without pause, without rest, the way it has come in for as long as there has been an Atlantic and an Irish coast to receive it. Port España is a small indent in the coast just west of the causeway, nothing much to look at from the cliff path that runs above it. A rocky beach, a scatter of boulders, the sea working at the base of the cliffs with that rhythmic mechanical patience that the sea has, and that is, if you watch it for long enough, both soothing and faintly terrifying. There is no marker here, no monument, no sign explaining what happened in this water on the night of the 26th of October, 1588. The bay keeps its name, and the name keeps its memory, and that is all. 1,300 men drowned within sight of this cliff. They had sailed from Lisbon in May. They had crossed Biscay and the Bay of Biscay in a great crescent of sail that filled the horizon. They had fought their way up the English Channel under sustained fire, They had survived the fireships at Gravelines. They had turned north around Scotland in damaged ships with failing provisions, riding out one storm after another, watching the coastline of Ireland appear and disappear through rain and spray. They had managed somehow to get 3 separate shiploads of survivors together in a single bay and transfer them to one vessel and attempt the last leg home, and then, in the dark, the Rock, the names of the ships that sailed with the Armada and did not return, are recorded in the Spanish archives with the scrupulous accounting that Philip II demanded of everything: the San Juan de Sicilia, the El Gran Grifon, the Rata Encoronada, the Duquesa Santa Ana, the Santa Maria de la Rosa, the Trinidad Valenciera, the La Villa, the Santa Maria de la Visión, the Juliana, the Anunciada, the San Pedro Maya, the Falco Blanco Mediano, and the Girona, and many others whose names we have but whose wrecks we have not found, and some, perhaps, whose names even the archives do not hold. The Armada is sometimes described as Spain's first great defeat, the beginning of the end of Spanish power. This is not quite right. Spain remained dominant in Europe for another generation. It launched more armadas. Its armies continued to fight in the Netherlands. The silver of America continued to flow. What the Armada's failure did was not to destroy Spain, but to reveal, for the first time, the limits of what even the most powerful empire in the world could accomplish against the combination of a determined enemy, a narrow sea, and weather. It revealed the limits of certainty. Philip had been certain of God's favour, certain of the righteousness of his cause, certain that his meticulous planning would be sufficient. The storms reveal that certainty of this kind is not a form of knowledge. It is a form of exposure. Medina Sidonia brought the San Martin and perhaps 60 ships back to Spain through September and October of 1588, limping into Santander and other northern ports with men who were so ill that, according to contemporary accounts, they could barely crawl ashore. Medina Sidonia himself was sick. He had been seasick for most of the campaign, had commanded through illness and exhaustion, and the grinding anxiety of a man who had told his king from the beginning that this was a bad idea and had been overruled by faith. He made it home. Many of his men did not. He retired to his estates in Andalusia and spent the rest of his life administering them with the quiet competence that had always been his primary skill. History has been unkind to him, because history likes drama and heroes and clear failures, and Medina Sidonia defies all of those categories. He was not heroic, but he was not cowardly. He was not brilliant, but he was not stupid. He was a man of limited gifts placed in an impossible situation by a king who would not hear no, and he did the best he could with what he had. The Armada's failure was not his fault, or not primarily his fault, and the sailors who served under him knew it, even if history sometimes forgets it. Elizabeth I lived another 15 years after the Armada, dying in 1603, the last of the Tudors, in a room at Richmond Palace in the small hours of the morning. She had been ill for weeks and had refused to eat or sleep properly, standing for long periods, as if she could not bring herself to lie down. When she finally did, she did not rise again. The England she left behind was Protestant and embattled, and deeply aware of how close it had come to a different fate in 1588, and beginning tentatively to extend itself across an ocean that the storms of that autumn had, in a sense, reserved for it. And somewhere beneath the waters of the North Antrim coast, and the Blasket Sound, and Kinnago Bay, and Streedia Strand, and a dozen other cold and rocky places along the western edge of Europe, the fleet that went out in May of 1588 with blessed banners and priests on every ship, and the absolute conviction of its king that God was watching over it. That fleet is still there, scattered, buried, colonized by time and marine growth, visited occasionally by divers who understand, when they hold a gold chain that has been on the seafloor for 4 centuries, that they are holding something that was once warm against a man's chest, that crossed an ocean in the hand of a man who believed he was doing God's work, and who ended his journey on a rock in the dark. The sea keeps its dead with extraordinary faithfulness. It does not forget. It simply holds what it is given in the cold and the dark for as long as the holding lasts. And when the sand shifts and the current runs in the right direction, and a diver descends at exactly the right point on exactly the right morning, the sea gives something back, a ring, a chain, a coin from Potosi, and in that moment 4 centuries collapse, and the past is not past at all, but present, and cold and specific and true. The Armada sailed in 1588. The storms came in September. The wrecks have been on the seabed for 400 years, and in a museum in Belfast, in a carefully lit case, a gold ring rests in silence, with an inscription on the inside that someone had engraved there before a departure that ended at the bottom of the Irish Sea. No tengo más que darte. I have nothing more to give you. Whoever you were, whoever wore that ring, wherever you came from and whatever you believed, the ring came home, even if you did not. The sea gave it back. The sea gives things back eventually. It just takes a very long time.